Great. Thanks, Jesse.
Well, there you go.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the 12 FAR working group of Manhattan Community Board 4. Under all normal procedures of the community board and under the emergency orders of the mayor, we conduct our business remotely via Zoom. So this is following all of that same protocol. This working group was formed after a year and a half of reviews by the Chelsea Land Use Committee, the Hell's Kitchen Land Use Committee, and the HHS Committee on housing density concerns that were brought up during the state budget year after year. We decided to, instead of going through all the committees, have essentially a joint committee of the three committees, form a working group to just specifically tackle housing density and the state limitation and any possibility of that being removed and how the city would then handle that. As an overview, just so that people are aware, the term floor area ratio, FAR, is what it's referred to more colloquially, is the ratio of building upon a land, is the simplest way of thinking of it. So if you have a square and you have a 1 FAR, you can have 1 square built upon it. If you have a 2 FAR, you can have 2 squares built upon it. But if you have a 2 FAR, you can cut all of it in half and stack it. So you can have 4 floors, the floor area ratio on half of the property. It's a ratio of the floor area to the buildable land, is the simplest way of thinking about this. This has nothing to do with height, building envelope, or anything else like that. It's just purely a density ratio. The state last year and again this year, there is language in the multiple dwelling law that caps residential FAR at 12. In the 2 last budget cycles that we have been discussing this, there's been a proposal to allow cities over 1 million population to have zoning regulations that would allow higher density residential FAR. And so that is what we're discussing, is if the state were to pass that, the 12 FAR cap would be potentially changed through new zoning regulation at the city level. There aren't that many cities over 1 million, so New York City is the one most greatly impacted by that. So tonight is our first working group meeting. As I say, we'll be doing these publicly. We have this one planned as a panel discussion that we have some experts in the field to talk to us from different perspectives. The working group will then convene 3 times over the next month to kind of hash through these discussion points today, the discussions we've had at the various committee meetings, and see if we can't find some form of consensus. The subsequent meetings will be happening on Wednesday, April 26th, Wednesday, May 10th, and Thursday, May, what does that say? 18th, I think it says on my notes. I can't read my own handwriting, sorry. It'll be published though. So I'd like to start tonight with working group members introducing themselves from the committee. Then I'll introduce the panelists. I have a series of questions I'm going to ask the panelists. The normal procedures at committee meetings is there's usually a presentation of some sort, committee members ask questions, and then we open it up for public discussion. I've asked all the working group members to send me the questions in advance so that I will be asking all the committee questions to start. I have about 18 of them, so we'll go through the 3 panelists with that. I'll then open it back up to working group committee members to ask any follow-up questions if they have any. Then we'll offer board members the opportunity to ask questions, and then we'll ask general public if they have any questions. So that will sort of be the proceeding of tonight's meeting. So let's get started with working group committee members introducing themselves, notably which committee you're from to be a part of this committee. So let's start with Carrie.
Hi, I'm Carrie Keenan. I am the co-chair of Chelsea Land Use Committee.
Thanks, Carrie. David Solnick.
Yes, hi, I'm David Zolnick. I'm on the Clinton Land Use Committee.
Thank you, David. Bobby.
Hi, my name is Roberta. I'm on the Housing, Health, and Human Services Committee.
Great, thanks. Brad Pescarella from Chelsea Land Use Committee had a family issue today. He's not going to be joining us, but he's also on. I haven't, Jesse, have Lowell or Aaron joined us? I don't see them yet.
Lowell is just joining us now.
Sorry, I was late.
Okay, no worries, Lowell. Introducing ourselves and our committees.
That a cue?
That was you. You're up, Lowell.
I'm Lowell Kern. I'm former chair of the board. I'm on Chelsea Land Use and Waterfront Parks and Environment.
Great. Thank you, Lowell. And Viren might be joining us as well. Many of you are probably seeing the fact that we're not using a webinar format, but a full regular Zoom panel today. So I request that everybody make sure they're muted during the discussion so that there's no distractions. Also, I recommend you go up to the top right corner and on view, click speaker view so that the speaker's image becomes more prominent and you can hear better and see better what they're saying. There will not be any share screening or any presentations like that. So that might help you in following along tonight. So we have tonight 3 panelists. We tried to address some issues that were raised at various committee questions to give us a broad range of perspectives on this 12 FAR issue. So we have with us tonight Anna Levin, who is a former Community Board 4 member and a former Planning Commissioner member. We have Andrew Schwartz from Taconic Partners, which is a developer in our community. And we have George Janes, who is a urban planner. So I'm going to start by asking each of them to introduce themselves and give a little bit of their thoughts. And one other final thing, I'm asking all people to sort of keep their answers to approximately 2 minutes or somewhere in that range. So we're not going on for too long on one particular topic. So George, let's get started with you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'm an urban planner. I have a private practice. I do a lot of work with community-based organizations. I work with a lot of Manhattan community boards, but not yours. But basically, I try to interpret zoning for people and so that they can understand what it means for their community. So on the multiple dwelling law, the question, Paul, that you asked about general thoughts on the 12 FAR cap and the multiple dwelling law. The multiple dwelling law is a strange law, right? It was developed as a replacement for the new law tenement regulations. It's almost 100 years old, and if you read it, it reads like it's over 100 years old, right? There's issues in there on fat boiling and rendering and like stuff like this that you just wouldn't see in modern legislation. It's been amended, over time, but ultimately that leaves a law that's kind of like a Frankenstein law, like little bits of old things with new things all put together. It's just not elegant. All that said, in terms of my general thoughts on the 12 FAR is that I find it a useful, 12 FAR cap is a useful governor on some poor planning instincts by the city of New York. And for evidence, I will quote the former deputy mayor, Vicky Bean, who said shortly after she left office, quote, "We tried for 8 years to get the state to lift the 12 FAR cap. People would ask me, why aren't you rezoning the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, or other parts of Manhattan? Well, the answer is pretty much you're already at the cap, so there's no place to go," unquote. Now, I'm a planner that works with communities, and so therefore, I have a problem with this because she didn't say that we haven't done the planning for rezoning on the Upper East or Upper West Side. She didn't say that we haven't engaged with the community about the potentials of a rezoning. She said simply she couldn't do it because of the law. As a general rule, my personal opinion is that kind of top-down planning is a bad idea, and the 12 FAR cap protects certain neighborhoods, not all neighborhoods, because all neighborhoods don't need it, but certain neighborhoods in Manhattan from rezonings that they didn't necessarily ask for and are not necessarily supporting.
Great, thanks, George. Anna, same to you, just brief introduction of yourself and a fast overview of your thoughts on the cap.
Yeah, sure. So it's fun to be here. I was one of you for from 2001 to 2009, chaired the Chelsea Hell's Kitchen Land Use Committee during the period that turned out to be a crazy period of development for CB4. It was when the Hudson Yards rezoning was established and the High Line rezoning was established. And I wrote 60 ULURP reports. And, the theme of all of those was advocating for sensible development in CB4, recognizing, it's one of the hallmarks of CB4 has always been to figure out how to grapple with change and how to shape change to best meet neighborhood needs. I learned from CB4 that just saying no to something wasn't really going to get you to the table. And so I think that and so after in 2009, Scott Stringer appointed me as the Manhattan Borough President's representative on the City Planning Commission. I was reappointed by Gail Brewer, and I stepped down in June of this year. So yeah, June of this year. So almost a year ago. So I'm in retirement. But during that time, I saw a real shift in the way neighborhoods were being approached. When I joined the commission, the big theme was about protecting neighborhoods, respecting neighborhood context. The pressure to build more housing has ratcheted up year by year to the point where you hear much more now about the need to build housing, in particular affordable housing, and much less in broad terms about neighborhood context. So I think that's just the reality of the world that we're working in. And as George acknowledged, this has been on, or I think in the introduction, Paul, you alluded to it. It's been on the agenda for a very long time. Let's get rid of this cap in the multiple dwelling law because it is artificially limiting the way we can plan for neighborhoods. Now, as I understand it, this feature of the multiple dwelling law, I mean, George is correct, it is a Frankenstein. It has all sorts of crazy stuff in it. But this particular piece of it got implemented in November of 1961 as kind of the predicate for the New York City zoning resolution, which was implemented in December of 1961. And the idea there, that was the era of Tower in the Park zoning. And also an era when we were still wanting to separate commercial use and residential use. And so the framework in the zoning resolution was that we should have mainly commercial zones and mainly residential zones. But where you had a commercial zone, you could allow some residential in, but you didn't want it to go crazy. So you had to, so the 12 FAR cap relates to the zones where the city really wanted to see commercial development. So there's a higher FAR that's allowed for commercial development. That benchmark was 15. That was in 1961, the highest amount of FAR in a commercial project. Well, of course, we've now blown way through that. Hudson Yards has places with 33 FAR. And it strikes me that the 12 FAR cap, if you look back to why it was implemented, is really a vestige of the past and doesn't sort of fit into the current zoning scheme. Lifting the cap, I don't think, it would still have to, if the cap weren't there, it would be entirely up to the city processes to decide what kind of zoning was appropriate on a particular site. And that, of course, would mean Mueller. I just think that having local control of this issue makes more sense. And the roots of the cap don't exist anymore. So it's a little bit nonsensical. It's an artificial impediment to planning sensibly.
Great. We are definitely coming back to some of those points, Anna. Thanks for that introduction.
Sure.
Andrew.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Andrew Schwartz. I work for Taconic Partners, which is developed or developing 2 residential properties in the district, and also owns a commercial building on 619 West 54th Street, which was converted into a life science hub. I head up Taconic's residential asset management program. We have about 3,000 units under management from the Lower East Side to Hell's Kitchen, and then some rent stabilized buildings in the outer boroughs in the Bronx. When I spoke to Paul and we went through what some of the questions are today, I put my thoughts together regarding the 12 FAR and what it means. I think one point is clear, and it's been echoed obviously a lot in the news and throughout, is that there's a housing crisis for the working class and lower income New Yorkers. I think lifting the cap could provide some housing expansion opportunities. And to Anna's point, lifting the cap is not going to do anything on its own. any development proposal is still going to have to go through environmental review and equally extracting public review process. What I think is important, though, in my opinion, is that if the cap is lifted, there is some tie with increased density and requirement for MIH.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. In terms of continuing on with introductions, Viren has joined us. Viren, can you say hello to everybody for us, please?
Hi, I'm Viren Brambit. I'm an architect, urban designer. I work in the city and I also teach here at Columbia and City College.
Thanks, Brad. I also want to thank some of the representatives from elected officials' offices who are here. We have people here from the Manhattan Borough President's office, from Assemblymember Tony Simone's office, and from State Senator Hoylman Segal's office. As well, I see a bunch of different people from various block associations across the district. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to continue on, if I could, with a question to George. Can you walk through a little bit? We're talking about MDL and we're talking about zoning, but that's city and that's state and it's different.
Yes.
Can you give us a little bit of what those differences are, how they interact with one another?
Well, sure. So state law trumps city law, right? And so city law needs to be consistent with state law. So the current zoning is limited to 12 FAR in part because 12 FAR residential, because the MDL is limited to 12 FAR residential. But also, state actions have to follow state law as well. So you're familiar with GPPs, general project plans from the state. Right now, GPPs, they can ignore city zoning, right? They don't have to follow city zoning. However, they do have to follow the multiple dwelling law, and they can't ignore that. So it is the multiple dwelling law is a governor on state actions as well. There are things that would happen in zoning right away that if you lifted the 12 FAR cap, certain special permits, you would see a lot more activity with transfer of development rights from landmarks, because you could suddenly get up to over 12 FAR. I think you'd also see in special permits, large scale special permits, you could get over 12 FAR in a zoning lot. And I think you'd also see the brand new subway bonus that the subway bonus, we passed zoning text amendment recently to greatly expand the areas that could receive the subway bonus. You'd see that used a lot more too, because now you could actually use your bonus in 10 FAR districts in 12 FAR districts for residential use. Because currently, right now, you're bumping up into the 12 FAR cap.
Thanks, George. Anna, can I follow up with you on a little bit of that too? Can you expound a little bit more on that, the difference between city and state, and how you see, notably from the city's perspective, where those instances that George talked about, how that could actually manifest?
Well, first off, I can't speak for the city. I was the borough president's appointee on the commission. My job was to fight against what the city was trying to do. So just to make that clear. Yeah, no, I think George is right. The MDL is really it trumps local zoning. And, so what the MDL says goes. As far as the details that George played out, I haven't thought about those, but there would have to be a whole unspooling of analysis at the city level to figure out how to adapt to a lifting of the cap. And I think that should have to happen. The lifting of the cap should be contingent on figuring out how the city was going to accommodate the lifting of the cap. They should be sort of a trigger to the effectiveness of any lifting of the cap. And of course, the primary feature of the accommodation ought to be a strong commitment to inclusionary housing as part of any additional residential floor area that would be created.
Great, thanks, Anna. Andrew, as someone coming in from more on the development side, how do you navigate those differences at the state level, cap level, city zoning, and how do you tackle those integrated components?
Yeah, well, it's very challenging, obviously, building in New York and developing in New York. You know, we've gone through several ULURPs, including the building on 525 West 52nd Street. You know, we work closely with third-party consultants. Sometimes we engage with lobbyists. But every site that we look at, and we look at pretty much every site that's on the market, goes through a stringent underwriting process based on the zoning and what's permissible and what we're trying to change if there is going to require a change in density. You know, Taconic bought a site in Inwood about 6 or 7 years ago, along with L&M partners, and you know, they waited for that site to be rezoned, and it finally went through, and now we're going to deliver, you know, 700 units, 50% of which are affordable. So I think that that's a real success story about what happened there, and what's being built. I'm not sure if that is directly going to apply if, you know, if the FAR were somehow lifted and MAH was a requirement. But I can say that we're delivering the affordable units there because of the rezoning change. But navigating the zoning law and the text is obviously extremely cumbersome process.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'm going to come to you next because George raised some issues, and you touched on that you haven't really dug too deep into it. But I'm wondering if you know of any auditing of the zoning code to identify any of those possible scenarios where residential buildings larger than 12 could be constructed without an action subject to ULURP, or where rezonings resulting in residential FAR in excess of 12 could possibly not be subject to MIH.
I'm not aware of an audit. This has been a priority of the Department of City Planning for a long time. I remember when Carl Weisbrod became chair of the commission and director of the department, he sort of announced, I guess that was in the last budget cycle or a previous budget cycle, that this is one of his, this is the main impediment to the development of residential housing, and we have to lift the cap. I don't know whether, I mean, that's a good question for the department, what work they have done to analyze this issue, but because it's certainly something that they have wanted to see happen for a long time. So, you know, as you know, the MIH law only applies to new FAR. So George has spelled out a number of scenarios in which existing FAR might move around in a way as a result of this, and that wouldn't be subject to MIH. But if we're rezoning areas to take the residential floor area above 12, that of course would have to be coupled with MIH. And I would, as I said before, I would think for the community board, a good thing to advocate for would be application of MIH deeper into the residential floor area. I mean, we've been limited now to upzonings only, but if we're talking about a fundamental change in the MDL, lifting the cap, that's an important enough change. It seems to me a rational thing to push for is applying MAH to some already existing residential floor area. First, and this is like right in the middle, but I think it's really great that this task force is doing this work, because it's not, I think the issue shouldn't be, should we lift the cap or not? I mean, that is sort of a predicate issue, but the real value of this work is for you all to lay out what you think would be important to have included if the cap were to be lifted, what the conditions should be for lifting the cap. That's where CB4 does its best work. Is by anticipating what might be coming at you and thinking through how you want it to apply, if it has to apply, because you might not want it to apply, but what if it does?
Thanks, Anna. And I always say, compliments to CB4, we all stand on the shoulders of the great leaders before us. So thank you for that. George, I'd like to come to you a little bit, digging a little deeper into this about areas where we might have some either vacant residential holding capacity. And if housing supply is an issue, why, if we have some housing capacity, why do we always talk about lifting the cap?
New York City is a very big place, right? It's not all. I am guilty of being Manhattan centric. I live here. I do a lot of work in Manhattan, but New York City is a extraordinarily large place. And if you were to do a basic planning exercise, which is calculating your vacant residential holding capacity, which is simply the maximum residential allowable minus existing equals vacant residential holding capacity. And if you do that, it's again a very basic, simple planning exercise. You get billions of square feet of unused development rights. Now, you can't use all of that, right? You can never use it 100% efficiently, but there's still a lot of space, and a lot of that space is in R8 districts in the Bronx, or in R6 districts in Bushwick, or East Flatbush, or Brownsville, or East New York. Like, there are places in New York City, when we look at it as a whole, that has an enormous amount of holding capacity. And, we're seeing activity now in these areas, right? We're seeing single family neighborhoods in East Flatbush where there's houses with driveways and garages that are zoned R6 for apartment houses. And then, people come out and they look at, oh, there's a 6-story apartment building across the street from me now. And it's on their single family neighborhood block. And for 50 years, we didn't see that kind of development pressure out there, but now we're starting to. And even in Manhattan, we have substantial amounts of vacant holding capacity. But I think we're talking about this question because this is mostly a Manhattan issue, right? Because if you're going to upzone Bushwick, it's not going to go to 10 FAR, right? It's not going to go to an R10 district. It's going to go to R6 to R7, or maybe parts with R8. You're not going to be upzoning areas like that with, where this even applies. It's in places like the Upper East and the Upper West Side, in CB6, and probably yours as well, where you can upzone already 10 FAR districts, and you can get to higher levels of development. And that's the way MIH currently works. So as MIH is currently designed, you have to upzone. And so therefore, if you have R10 equivalent districts currently, you cannot put MIH there. Now, the question is, I think for boards like yours and committee members like yours should consider is, well, does that mean you should raise the 12 FAR cap and upzone these areas? Or does that mean you should fix the R10 issue? And I think at least fixing the R10 bonus program currently is something that should be in the discussion.
Great, George. Thanks. Kind of as a follow-up to that, George, you had mentioned the landmarks area, historic. We're concerned about, I'll get to it. We are concerned about historic districts and special districts, and that we don't want increased density in those areas. So do you see how that when you talk about underbuilt, lower than 12, this housing vacancy, would you say, did you include in the billions of square footage historic districts and special districts?
Yes, I certainly did. It was a simple exercise. And in historic districts, in theory, there can be development there, and if we lift the 12 FAR cap, it's going to be easier to transfer development rights off of them. But it's something that could be rerun without those. It just depends on what your exercise is trying to look at.
Right. Okay. Thanks. So Andrew, you've been silently waiting. You've been involved in a lot of projects, and you mentioned you have both commercial and you have residential and you have affordable housing. Does this residential cap play a factor in how you make development decisions and where you approach your business strategy?
It does. I mean, everything plays a factor. It does, along with the absence of a tax abatement program, 421A, which obviously I think is a very important issue, along with the FAR 12. But it does, absolutely, what you can build upon the site as of right, as opposed to, going through, let's call it a ULURP process. Development is very risky, very expensive, particularly nowadays, if you want to use the right building materials and the right builder and union labor. And so if there's a cap on what you can deliver, obviously it's going to play into the underwriting. But yes, we look at it all.
And to continue digging in that a little bit more, Andrew, Anna mentioned earlier that there's a residential cap, but there is not a commercial cap. Sort of what are your thoughts on that, and how do you approach that issue too?
Well, yeah, that's hard for me to reconcile, especially, in neighborhoods that have a disproportionate access to jobs, transportation, and amenities, but they don't have the residential population. There's mainly commercial buildings and a large commercial office population. That, I think, is something that needs to be realigned. And so if in these amenity-rich neighborhoods, if there's somehow a way to lift the cap and that will promote more housing and density along with inclusionary housing, then I think could be a good toolbox, good tool in the city's toolbox moving forward.
Great, thanks. And I want to come back to you a little bit and talk a little bit more about sort of the politics of this. So you mentioned that the city would have to take action if we were to do this. And you've now been a community board member and an appointee to the Planning Commission, so you understand politics as much as the rest of us do. How are we certain that the lifting the cap will be in the people's interest and in the real estate industry's interest? And in that vein, we have council member deference, and so council members protecting our areas. So how can you reassure us that the city is actually going to have
look, I would say that isn't that what ULURP is supposed to be for? And isn't that what community boards are supposed to be for, is to organize and advocate for their communities and to get out in front of these issues and make it clear what's important locally.
As a former community board member, Anna, did you always feel like the city always listened to everything you suggest?
Well, let me say they listened to Board 4 more than they listened to many other community boards. It was astonishing. I came out of this thinking everyone's like Board 4. Well, guess what? Not. And there are many community boards across the city that just aren't nearly functional enough. And those are the ones that I would really worry about. But I want to loop back once to, I'm not even answering your question, but I'll get there. George referred to, it is quite correct that this residential cap applies mostly. The R10 districts that exist now are primarily in Manhattan, but there's been a tremendous growth of R10 equivalent zoning in Brooklyn. And a lot of the developments you see along Flatbush Avenue are a result of exactly this problem, where they managed to plan something that makes for, I don't even know how high those FARs go. Some of them, I think, go into the 20s. But the point is to figure out how much development you can, in a financially feasible way, cram onto these sites. And if you're limited to 12 FAR, well, the rest is going to be commercial. We have been in a market where those kinds of, density packing underwritings would work. I think Anthony knows more about Andrew knows much more about this than I do, but we're heading into a period where commercial development is going to be pretty challenging. And there's just this tremendous appetite for housing, especially if we can figure out how to get the tax programs to work for it. So now's the time to really push for maximizing residential development in areas that are already zoned for something huge, go well beyond the 12 FAR with a commercial zoning designation. Well, why does that have to be commercial? Why couldn't we use that already planned development potential for residential? But so back to your question, I mean, I think we do need to be building this housing, and we all need to be engaged in the planning that will lead to it. And ULURP is supposed to do that. ULURP has its challenges, maybe needs some improvement, but I've got much more confidence about doing that at the local level than having it artificially limited at the state level. Now, member deference, that's another one that has had some interesting twists and turns in the last couple of years, where it didn't used to be that member deference was quite as strong as it was. I remember when Chris Quinn was speaker, and we'd have applications come through where there was pretty strong, very local, hyper local community pushback. But if you looked at it from a broader planning perspective, the thing maybe made sense. And somehow council leadership would work it out so that the project could get approved and the local council member wouldn't take the heat. That's not the case anymore. And now every local council member is immediately accountable to their constituents for what happens only in their districts. So that makes member deference, it helps you understand how we've gotten to such a strong situation with member deference, but it really prevents planning at a borough or citywide level. So I don't know where to end that thought.
I'll interrupt you. I'll interrupt you and say to Andrew, look at Andrew, you were called out by Anna on that one. So maybe you want to pipe in a little bit more as well. Specifically about how the commercial residential pace, the demand for residential is outpacing commercial, but the residential density is lower than commercial. How does that integrate for you?
Well, I think to Anna's point, the commercial office market, particularly, call it the Class B buildings in the Garment District, for instance, are facing significant headwinds, and it's troubling. Taconic owns a building on 449th Avenue on 35th Street and 9th Avenue. They've looked at trying to convert it to a residential building, and it doesn't work, which I don't think is any surprise. If you looked at the floor plates, how far the windows are or to get legal light and air. And there's the leasing market for that type of building is completely dried up. So I don't work on the commercial side per se, but the question is what happens to a building like that? And I think it's very disconcerting, especially when there's so much upward pressure on rents, all the way through from the affordable level up to the luxury market. It's just incredible that how much pressure is being put on New Yorkers to be able to afford rent.
Thanks, Andrew. That's good perspective. And I'm going to bounce back to you for a second, because you had we're talking a little bit about, and you raised that community board should be thinking ahead before what if scenario, right? If the state does remove this, so why are we having this conversation? Why do we think we have to lift the cap first before we do this? Why are we in this situation?
Well, because it's part of the governor's housing platform. It's an issue that keeps raising its head. It's out there. There is tremendous pressure to build housing. Who knows whether it gets traction in Albany and finally happens, but if it does happen, you want to be ready for it.
And is there a way to pass that legislation at the state level prior, working with MDL in a different way? Would you be familiar with any of that?
No, I'm not.
No. Okay,
I think
that's fine.
that should certainly be part of your advocacy.
No.
Look, maybe it makes sense to reform the MDL, but if you do that, it should be coupled with this. I don't know, George has his hand up.
Yeah, George.
George knows more about this than I do.
Yeah, and George, I did want to, yeah, okay, go ahead, George.
Well, I just, just to directly address that question is that, we have been talking about raising the cap now. I mean, let's first say like, we didn't talk about raising the cap for 40 years, right? And then more recently, it is something that has come up. And past efforts have not involved the budget process. Last year, maybe the year before it did. But before that, it was just legislation and there were hearings held on it. And I testified at one of those hearings. And it is, I think if it were more out in the open and there would be more debate and discussion and understanding of consequences and really an honest exchange of ideas, I think that would be the way, that's the right way to do it, right? The fact that it's all wrapped up in budget negotiations and what's happening behind the scenes, it's just, it's not the right way to do it.
So I'm gonna challenge a little bit more that on George on this one, because a lot of the people saying home rule advocacy that the MDL should not be worked on that much more so than local city zoning should be addressed and leave it in the hands of the local people to make those determinations. And you have, and I've seen your presentations, which are amazing. Thank you. I've seen you talk about a presentation of a creation of a new higher density residential zone in R11 zone. You want to talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure, I will. Just one clarification is that, I will say that the 12 FAR is a completely arbitrary number, right? And there are good more than 12 FAR buildings, and there are bad more than 12 FAR buildings. And there's a lot to be said for home rule, and it's kind of absurd that New York City has this limit, but Yonkers or New Rochelle doesn't, right? Because they're governed by the multiple residence law, and the multiple residence law has no FAR cap. It is something that is really bespoke for New York City. So that's, it has to be acknowledged. Everybody, whether you're a fan or a foe, has to say that's weird, right? That's a kind of strange situation to be in. But with that said, regarding the R11, so the R11 is not my idea. I learned about it from John West. I think it evolved from the Sutton Place rezoning from 5 or 6 years ago. And the idea of the R11, the R11 addresses the problem that if you're already in an R10 neighborhood, R10 equivalent neighborhood, you can't map MIH. And so the idea of the R11 is that so in an R10 neighborhood, your residential is limited to 10 FAR. If you provide affordable housing, either on-site or off-site, you can go to 12 FAR. And that's in the old 1987 bonus program, which is terrible. It produces almost no affordable housing and you get a 20% FAR bonus. It's a giveaway. So the idea of the R11 is to get rid of the old program and replace it with with 2 FAR bonus for residential, but 1 FAR of commercial or community facility. So you could get to 13 FAR. So you'd have 3 FAR bonus, provide a meaningful amount of affordable housing. And then you would have, by definition, mixed use buildings. You would either have with commercial overlays or commercial districts, you would have some commercial in the building. You would have community facility in the building. Maybe you would have multiple floors of non-residential uses in the building. And so, it's, I think, a way to address the flaw in the R10 program. Now, the R10 program was designed that way, in 87, but wasn't fixed in 2015 or 14 when we were putting together MIH, because the plan was to lift the 12 FAR cap. So you didn't have to address the flaw in the existing program at the time, but we haven't lifted the cap. And so that flaw has extended until now. And if we don't lift it again into the future.
Thanks, George. So that leads to a good follow-up for Andrew in discussing the MIH and increasing density to qualify for MIH. And Andrew, so what are your thoughts on increasing the number of affordable units through MIH in various housing developments? And if there were changes made, like let's say we create higher density and it increases the percentage of MIH in each development that's above 12, how would that influence your ability to develop affordable housing units?
I think it would be a good thing. I think it'd be a good thing for the city. I would say that I would tether, I guess, the MIH to some AMI that's at the lower band, and have a large percentage of units below 60 or 40. Because in some of these neighborhoods, when you start getting up to 120, 130, you're almost at market. So it's not really solving the problem, I think, that it was intended to solve. But I think from our perspective, just as what happened in Inwood, although the project in Inwood probably wouldn't work without the tax abatement. And I know I keep coming back to that, but I think it's part of the discussion too, obviously, in all of the ways that the city is going to be able to build the 1 million homes or 800,000 that Hochul was calling for over the next decade. So I think as long as there's a process where it's the MIH is tethered to AMIs that make sense, then I think it could work.
So you're saying trigger and have a lower AMI. That's interesting perspective. Okay, thanks. All right, so I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to ask each of the three panelists to answer, and I'll start with Andrew since you were just talking. If the city were to create a new high-density residential zone to regulate properties potentially impacted by the removal of the state's 12 FAR cap, and whose adoption would be triggered by that removal, what regulations would you like to see in that new zone? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I kind of answered it already, but obviously the AMI levels corresponding to the affordable units. I think obviously environmental concerns around sustainability. Obviously, local law 97 is its own animal, but regulations regarding emissions and I think natural gas stoves are probably on their way out, and buildings are going to be all electric moving forward. But I think as much as, and I'm not a sustainability expert, but tying affordable housing and sustainability and community give back are all good things if the developer is going to benefit from increased density.
Community give back is not a word I would always use myself, though, Andrew, but that's good of you. Anna, same question to you. What would you like to see in any sort of zoning regulations if there was a new zoning regulation that had higher density for housing?
Well, I think Andrew nailed the two big ones. And I guess one contextual observation I would have is about AMI levels. It was routine when I was on the commission that the developers would come in with an application for moderate and middle income, applying MIH with the moderate and middle income bands and get knocked down to the low income bands. There is such a dearth of the very low income housing in the city. That's where the need really is, and particularly in neighborhoods outside of Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn. 100 AMI is market, so we don't need to be building that stuff. So I would think it should be the AMI levels on the affordable component of this new density should really target the very low income. Now, I know that's at odds with some of the positions that Board 4 has taken. I'm thinking particularly of the Lirio, which recently went through rezoning. That had its whole other issues because the city wasn't, the city was jettisoning the deal they'd made when I was still on the community board. I mean, it's just crazy that it took so long, but that's a whole nother story. But I will say that I think Board 4 has its position on AMI levels for very good reasons, but you're an outlier. The politics are not in your favor on that one. I'm not advocating that you change it. I think you should fiercely defend it, but I think you have to understand the world in which you're operating. I think Andrew's right to lean in on sustainability features and ways in which the building can live as lightly on the land as possible and also contribute to the streetscape and the surrounding and local parks and greening. I mean, this is big density that we have to figure out how to live with.
I appreciate it, Anna, you saying that the increased density, lowest AMI bands is better for every place else in the city but us, and we're the ones confronted with the density concerns in the greatest way. So yeah, we have a conflict here.
Yeah. No, I get it.
So thanks for pointing that out. George, I'm going to wrap with you on that same question. What would you like to see in zoning regulations if we have increased density?
Well, okay, all right. So I would like to see what the local communities would want to see. I think this should be something that is driven from the bottom up. I think that's what all land use planning should be driven from the bottom up. I believe in local planning and local community plans, and I think it should be different based upon what the interests are of the local community. That said, I would also say that when I go into these things, I'm aware we live in a very big, complicated city, and when you're making a big change, you should make certain not to break something. First do no harm, and so I think that speaks to incrementalism when you talk about we already have affordable housing programs in place. You would build off of those. You already have urban design conventions and forms in place, tower up base, contextual, and building off of things that already work is generally not a mistake. But if that really should be a local decision.
Well, but we just pointed out the conflict there, George. Right. So
but listen, if you have different goals for your community in CB4 than what the city has, that's okay. It's okay to have a different, at least in my opinion, we devolve local control all over the country to local communities. Local community in New York City is, a very, very large city, bigger than most states. Right. And it's kind of crazy that this big city, will decide the land use plan for at a lot by lot basis. It doesn't make any sense. It's something that really should be driven primarily by you all, by people in the community. And, I'm going to stick with that. It's the right way to do planning.
Fantastic. Thanks, George. So everyone, we're about an hour into our hour and a half scheduled meeting. That's the round of questions I had for the three panelists. I'd like to ask any of the members of the working group if they want to raise their hand, if they have any questions that they feel they want to follow up on, or if there are additional points that they wanted to have made and address specific questions to a panelist. So I'll start with you, David.
Yeah, follow-up questions. Well, two things. First, a point, and then a follow-up question to that last question. Point to George. All planning should be very local, and I mean, my sense is that this is not a local problem. The lack of housing is not simply a local problem. It's a larger problem than that. And if you ask people, do they want bigger buildings next to them? They're going to say no. I mean, I don't. It doesn't. Now that doesn't mean the opposite should be true. That Big Daddy City should impose its will upon the community. But I think both of those extremes are a mistake, and that there needs to be, and generally is, but that there needs to be a middle ground that considers the larger issues of lack of housing in this case, and considers local issues, but neither one has a trump card. So I mean, I just disagree with the philosophy that all zoning, all land use decisions should be purely local. adamantly disagree with that. But anyway, regarding the question of, what you all three want to see or would want to see in a new zone, none of you addressed density. You've addressed important issues as far as inclusionary housing and, which is obviously a big one. But obviously the big question is what would be the new density, and how would it be capped, and how would it be regulated? How would it be restricted? How might the sort of gerrymandering of lots be prevented, perhaps, to not create these insane transfer TDRs, relations to historic districts, relations, obviously to special districts, but if you could address the actual density issue, meaning the new FAR, whatever that might be, and how that might be attenuated or regulated.
Let's do a quick round robin on this. George, I know you're going to say it's up to the locals. If they want 33, they can get it. Anna, want your answer, and Andrew. So go ahead, George.
Well, I would say it's up to a planning exercise, right? You do planning. You just don't come up with a number. You shouldn't also let the some sort of optimization or pro forma dictate it. That's not what planning is, right? It's not a real estate development deal, right? It's about developing the proper density and character for a neighborhood, which is going to be different from different neighborhoods. And just to address the point about the city can set up strategic direction. They can even give goals and targets for local communities, but it's got to be up to the community how they meet those goals and targets.
Right. Andrew, what's your thoughts on density specifically for that?
I think every neighborhood's different. I think every location is different, and I'm not a city planner. I'm not on the planning board, but I thought, that's what they're, not to echo George, but that's what they're there for. And so I don't think asking, a development group what kind of density they want is probably the best choice.
Anna?
Wow, that's a strong statement.
Well, to go with your strong statements, David. But actually, I have to say, David, I do agree with you. It's not. This is a citywide problem, and leaving it as a purely local question isn't going to get us. Isn't going to serve the city as a whole. So but that's the inherent balance we have to deal with here. Every site is going to be different and needs to be looked at, but it needs to be looked at locally. What kind of development should happen on this site? What kind of use is appropriate? It's the way you start with planning. What does the neighborhood need? What is the neighborhood context, and what can fit in here? So there's not going to be one answer for zoning. I think we have a historic, this 12 FAR or 10 bonusable to 12 FAR has crept up. It didn't start out being the fixture that it is now, but as development has gotten more and more dense and the housing need has increased, we've crept up to that. Now, where do you go beyond it? I don't know, but you have to apply traditional planning principles on a zone by zone, neighborhood by neighborhood basis to figure out what's going to make sense at that location. Is there transportation? Are there services? What kind of city support are you going to need to support whatever development you're planning there?
Great, thanks. Roberta, I'll go to you next.
Sure. So one of the questions that I had is specifically surrounding historic preservation and historic districts. Some very iconic landmark historic buildings, including in this community district, are residential and over 12 FAR. And it appears that, residential floor area and historic preservation are perhaps not as wildly at odds as I think some folks would like to present. one thing that I understand is that if you are, for example, developing on a single lot and you're able to go taller on that lot without taking development rights or performing lot mergers, you might be able to preserve historic buildings. I'm wondering if there is, blanket lift of the FAR cap, if there should be consideration of how this should work within historic districts, or if you believe that historic districts shouldn't be touched at all if there is the potential for new development.
Andrew, let's start with you on that one. And then I'm going to ask everybody, all three panelists to talk, but really short, like 30 seconds each, so we can get through a lot more topics.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton of experience developing in historic districts, but I think what you're saying makes sense to me, and from a high level. But I would defer to George and Anna and their thoughts.
Good answer. Anna, it goes to you then.
I'm going to pass to George. I don't have deep thoughts.
Yeah, I just don't know how relevant it will be to most historic districts, because when there's development in historic districts, it's LPC normally caps it at less than what it can do as of right. It's just typically how they do things.
Yeah, but George, it's also the transfers that get made.
That's true.
And if it's a landmark in a high density district, which is what CB4 has plenty of, then you have to worry about where that density is going to go.
Yep, fair enough. And just so people understand is that zoning lot mergers have to be within a block, a single block, but you can transfer development rights across the street from a landmark. So that means that you can find different places for it to go to. And lifting the 12 FAR cap would mean in high density landmark districts, you could find a lot more places for it to go.
Interesting, thanks. I'm going to go to Carrie next, and then Viren, doing the working group members first, then board members after that. So Carrie.
Thanks everyone. This is super informative. Paul's going to get mad at me for asking this question, but and he'd sort of asked this question already, but I'm a bit stuck on, and maybe this is for Anna because you've sort of been on both sides, but like I'm a bit stuck on, I know why we're having these conversations, and I know that this is about this is a zoning conversation, but like I can't quite get over, there are all these issues with MIH and AMI bans and land, transfer of development rights and all of these other things that feel like they should sort of be addressed before we talk about lifting the cap. And then, but we always go, and I know this isn't our choice, but we go straight to lifting the cap. So it's like, we're stuck in a position where we have to say, if you lift the cap, then instead of saying, city, you have, here are real issues, our real issues are, as you said, that, affordable housing isn't affordable, even to, those who supposedly need it the most. And that we could end up with these massive buildings because of, transfer development rights. And it's just, it feels like we're sort of not addressing the real issues before lifting the cap. And lifting the cap is just a sentence, like we're going to lift the cap and then everything's going to be fine. And then we'll be able to get to all this other stuff. And we've heard some presentations where the answer to that question has been, we can't even talk about that other stuff until we lift the cap. And it just feels a bit like, bullshit. So I just wanted to ask you, what you think about that, because as I try to wrap my head around even being able to support an if-then statement, I just feel like there are these things these really big issues that need to be addressed first.
You're absolutely right. But we're in a political process where there's momentum behind the idea of lifting the cap. So I got to deal with it. I'm put in mind listening to you talk. This is what happened with the sidewalk cafes and the sheds that went into the street.
Yeah, I happen to be on BLP as well. So good
you.
segue. Yeah.
But what happened was the city was all behind the idea of cleaning up the zoning to give authority over the sidewalk to the Department of Transportation before the Department of Transportation had developed any rules.
Right.
So that went through ULURP. We couldn't stop the ULURP. What we did was get a provision in there that said that the lifting of the zoning wouldn't become effective until the rules had been adopted by the city, had been established by the Department of Transportation and adopted by the city council. And I don't think that's happened yet.
It has not.
So those rules are still on the books, but that was exactly the issue that you're talking about.
And thanks for saying that. That's actually really good, a good analogy for me to understand. It feels like, we are of a land use team here, and these issues go so far beyond just land use. So they're so intertwined that I'm really trying to focus on how to just make it a land use thing in my brain. But I also want to ask a question about, I'm concerned that we are an advisory board and we are not, we do not, we just make recommendations. And I know that, we're powerful as a community board, but I'm concerned that if the cap were lifted, as you said, how many ULURP actions letters did you write? And it's like, where does the power really lie? Are we totally screwing over our city council members for this? Is that the last defense? So I guess I just need to understand that a little bit too, if anyone can answer that.
No, I think you're working in partnership with your city council members. And you might be working in partnership with some of the affected community boards. And if you get a big enough coalition going to talk about how we're going to address exactly the issues you identified before we lift the cap, something might happen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie.
If I may, I just say,
Yeah, George, go ahead.
Your disquiet, Carrie, has to do with the fact that there is no plan.
Yeah.
Right. And that we're just going to lift up the cap. The city used to actually produce these plans all the time, right? You go back in time and you look at these plans for the tower on base zoning and other new zoning paradigms. Essentially, they describe what they're going to do and then they go ahead and do it. And it's something that should be done, right? This was, as Vicki Bean said, they've been trying to lift the cap her entire career there during the de Blasio administration. Where was the plan regarding what they were going to do when the cap was lifted? So for 8 years, 9 years, whatever it is, there's been this effort to lift the cap. The city has wanted the cap lifted. You hear Dan Garodnick and other elected officials out there saying we have to do this. But where's the plan, right? We've been given sound bites. We've been given sound bites. We need to do this for affordable housing. We need to do this for housing in general. But there really isn't any depth to it, and I think that's where the flaw and that's where the disquiet comes in.
Thanks, George.
Thank you,
Aaron. I'm going to go to you next.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Aaron. Go.
Okay, so my question is quite similar to Carrie's, and I'm actually asking this question more from the point of view of many people in this room who are not architects or urban designers. They don't quite understand necessarily what lifting of the FAR cap would actually mean for them. Some in our neighborhood might know that because there's a lot happening in CB4, but across the city, for example, I was in a conversation this afternoon with a friend of mine who lives in Bushwick. And I just mentioned that I actually had to run for a meeting and I'm going to be running late. And it's about lifting the FAR cap to 12. And it's how does that affect me? I try to explain, it doesn't, exactly. So my question, George, and this is actually for everybody. The question is, if state promises to lift the cap, city still has the sort of weapons in its hands to do what it wants to do. So all three of you, my question is, I mean, you kind of have described it, but can you very sort of, layman's terms, explain what that means for particular districts where lifting of that cap would translate into much taller buildings versus the rest of the city where FAR is going to remain uneven? Does that make sense, what I asked?
And George, I'd like you to tackle this, but Andrew, I want to hear your thoughts on this too. So George.
Oh, you want me first? Okay. So lifting the cap, is if you lift the cap, it's going to affect the Upper East, Upper West, CB6, your community district, really a handful of in the Manhattan core, and it's really only going to affect. It's not going to affect Greenwich Village, right? It's going to affect already very high density areas, right? And so those already very high density areas will get allowed to have we'll allow to have bigger buildings. How much bigger will be how much the cap gets lifted and how much is put into that, meaning how much affordable housing is that going to have to generate? And how does that relate to building mass and height? And that's really an open question, but all we can say right now is bigger and more. And it's really going to really just focus downtown Brooklyn, those Manhattan community districts, Long Island City, and maybe one or two other places.
There's a counterpart to it, George. I'm sorry, I'm jumping in here, Paul, for a second. The counterpart is, what would be the counter argument that if we do this, how can we do that more evenly? So looking at different neighborhoods where maximum or whatever amount of investment has already been made, whether it's transportation or community services or universities or whatever have you. And that is the plan which states. Well, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so to me, as a planner, the Upper West and Upper East Sides are the most densely populated neighborhoods in America, right? They are the most, not in New York City, but in the country. And so the idea is that, well, this, as Vicky Bean said, would be to allow to upzone these neighborhoods. And I'm thinking, have you ever been to Ozone Park, right? Have you ever been into parts of Queens that actually have a subway service, right? You have a subway, and then you have houses with lawns and driveways and garages next to the subway. And you just go, this is not a good use of resources, right? And so the city, at least this is my observation, I know nothing inside, but my observation is that the city is now paying more attention to the outer boroughs and paying more attention to places where, you have this tremendous public investment in subways, in fixed transit, and fixed transit is a statewide asset that we all contribute to. And if you're ever going to trump local zoning or local control of zoning, it has to do with fixed public, major investments in particular areas. And if you look out to places like, Ozone Park is 0.5 FAR, right? And it's got a subway. and there are other places that are like that. And that's a citywide thing. That has nothing to do with the state, right? Or unless it's part of one of the Hochul's other efforts. It has nothing to do with the MDL. But I think more intelligent planning and zoning, or more comprehensive, that's a better word, comprehensive planning and zoning, I think would be, is what the city needs.
And George, I'm going to point out your answer to David Solnick's question. Well, those people in Ozone Park probably don't want higher density, so they would never allow that zoning to happen out there. So, this is a great. Andrew, did you go on this for us from your perspective? Or are you?
No, I think we've got it covered there.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Viren. That was great. So other board members, I see David Halauka and then Chris LeBron. So David.
Yeah, following on what George just said, doesn't it make sense that allowing even more development in the already dense and luxurious Upper East and Upper West Sides is simply going to discourage development in areas like Ozone Park? And aren't they only going to build luxury housing there? It's because these neighborhoods are so desirable. And building really tall buildings, it tends to be luxury housing. I think MIH is largely a fallacy that's being foisted on us as a spurious rationale for lifting the cap. It has produced, since it was introduced in 2016, I think fewer than 500 units a year. I don't see that turning into a flood of affordable housing by raising the FAR cap. And we're also not paying any attention to bread and butter zoning issues like light and air, and the fact that people don't tend to want to live in very dense neighborhoods as opposed to where they work, where they don't care so much whether it's dense. That's the reason commercial tends to have higher zoning. George, I watched your presentation to the Friends of the Upper East Side, and a lot of people who spoke at the end lived on the Upper West Side and were appalled at these gigantic buildings that were being built in their residential neighborhood. And you talked about alternatives to MIH for creating affordable housing. I think you said that the city could simply insist that 20% of all new housing be affordable. Rather than removing the 12 FAR cap, which I think is really something that just benefits developers who want to shoehorn more lucrative development into the two neighborhoods that are already the densest in the country. What other ways do you see, separate from raising the cap, that could create more affordable housing? And could you talk a little bit more about this 20% requirement that you mentioned before, as I recall?
I'm sure. So it's actually a 10% requirement. And
Hold on. I'm going to interrupt 1 second, George. Let's be cognizant of time. Like a minute and a half answer.
Okay, so
thank you.
The way we do affordable housing, our zoning solution for affordable housing is almost unique. Most jurisdictions don't do affordable housing through zoning the way we do it. They just simply require a minimum amount of affordable housing in every development. Most communities in Westchester County, for instance, they require 10% of the units in a multifamily building to be affordable housing, period. There is no upzoning, there is no MIH, there is just, you've got to do it. It is in part of the local law. If you want to build a building, you've got to get some affordable housing in there. And that means then you have affordable housing in every development. So affordable housing in every district, in every development, which is what you want, right? You don't want it just concentrated in certain areas that get the upzoning, and you want it everywhere, and or at least that's what I would think, and so I would say looking at other models that are used not only in New York but in other states is something that we should be looking at.
Thanks, George. Thank you, David. Chris LeBron.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can. You can go.
Okay, so the political issues in front of us, as Anna has stated, are kind of vast and wide. There's political will to upzone Midtown, the Upper West Side, and the Upper East Side, and there's no political will to have outer boroughs or outer counties of New York City answer to their sins of redlining. And so what we're going to see is an overdevelopment and oversaturation. New York City does have a 15% affordable housing requirement in new builds. However, it's insufficient because this area of New York City has lost the vast majority of its affordable housing to warehousing and illegal hotels, something that's plagued Hell's Kitchen and Chelsea for 15 years, if not more. My question is this to either Anna or George. When the mayor came out for this along with the speaker, the mayor also said he wanted to get rid of community boards in the ULURP housing process. What is available to communities once this cap is lifted to protect it from overdevelopment and the wrecking ball?
George, why don't you start and then we'll go to Anna a second.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to get rid of community boards that require a change to the charter. I don't think that's going to happen. The political process is what protects neighborhoods, right? It's having the community boards having an influence on their elected official and the planning commission to essentially try to protect their neighborhoods as best they can. I would, I'm in favor of more local control, as I've said, which would be a slightly different process. But we have the system that we have now, and you've got to work within it. It's the ULURP system, as Anna was talking about, and it does have certain protections in it, and some community boards do better other than using them.
Thanks, George. Anna, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think George covered it.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with board members for now. David Solnick, your hand is up again. Can I defer to Christine so she can?
Yes.
Thank you. Christine?
Yes, thank you. And good to see you, Anna.
Yeah.
Everybody else. So, I mean, would it make sense, you were all talking about defining boundaries for our if and when it's announced, would it make sense to say we want to limit that to areas which were already zoned for commercial? Because one of the things we have in our neighborhood is a large area of Hudson Yards, which is zoned currently for commercial, and where everybody's scratching their heads saying, we don't want to do commercial. So one of the things we could do as a really protection against everything else is to say, all right, we do it only for what is already zoned commercial. It would apply to Garment District, right, obviously. And it would apply to the GPP in the GPP around Penn Station, which would say, all right, those big buildings, instead of being all commercial, could be residential. And let's assume this is the only thing we agree to make, to remove the cap, and anything else we don't, because we are fine otherwise, and we have so much density and we have so much affordable housing. Why would we extend? Which doesn't preclude us later in the future to change that, by zoning actions. So is that something that would make sense? And indeed, I think the MIH at 25% is not enough. I mean, it would have to be more like what Andrew was talking, 40% or 45%. Etc. Does that make sense, or to envision?
So, Andrew, can we start with? Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean,
I think it makes sense to me. I'm just wondering if you do. I don't know if the cap is in place. Does it let some of the city's more affluent neighborhoods off the hook? I don't know, but that's what I'm wondering, and I think George and Anna maybe know better. But they're not necessarily contributing to the solutions to the housing crisis. So I didn't know if lifting the cap was one of the ways to do that in the more affluent areas. But what you're saying about the Garment District and commercial building certainly makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean Hudson Yard and the GPP, Penn South. So those places where there was an idea of building enormous, commercial building, and clearly that doesn't work anymore. So we need to find a fix.
Yeah, that strikes me as a very pragmatic thing, number one, to do, because that zoning density is already on the books. It's already committed to. You're never going to get it back. It's been through some kind of environmental review for commercial, but not residential. But never mind, it's there. So why don't you figure out how to use it most effectively for housing?
Yeah.
Right.
And you couple it with a more robust affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate it. David, I'm going to go to you, but we are running out tight on time. So you, and then Katie Savage, then Andrew Berman, and let's all be cognizant of fast questions and answers, please.
Yeah, it should be quick. What I'm hearing is that there is a desire to remove the cap and, or at least bring things back to city control, but we're all worried that we don't know how the hell, that all hell is going to break loose, and we haven't got a plan, and it's very complicated, and it's going to be a big fat mess. So, and that's quite understandable. So why not remove the cap from the state, except for state development projects where it probably should remain, because we don't want the state to be able to do things that the city doesn't want. So remove it for everything but state development projects, and impose it the same cap on at the city level. And then, so now nothing has changed, except we now have control. The city has control, but nothing has changed. And then establish a process for changing the zoning that considers all the things that have been brought up in this discussion tonight. A lot of very good points about the things that need to be considered if the cap goes away. And only when that process is completed would that now city cap be converted to the zoning created by this new process. And so, that's a quick fix to get it out of the hands of the state, put it in the hands of the city, but there's no risk because in the beginning, nothing changes. Only after a process of considering all these issues would the zoning actually be changed locally.
All right, I'm going to jump over to people from the public who are here. I see 4 hands up. Anna, Andrew, and George. Would you be willing to give us another 10, 15 minutes? Are you okay with that? Or do you want to call it out? Because we did ask you to just stay till 8.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've got another meeting starting right now, so I'm going to have to drop off. But
okay, that's understandable. Anna, we're very grateful and always great to see you.
Nice
and
to
thank
see
you for all
you.
your hard work.
I'll be interested to see how this comes out. Keep at it.
Thank you, Anna. Appreciate it.
So long.
George, Andrew, are you okay for another 10, 15 minutes, or what's your schedule like?
Yeah, 10 minutes, good.
Okay, all right. Thank you both very much. I appreciate your time tonight. So Katie, Andrew, Elka, and Christine's hand just went up. I saw another name, but I'm going to limit it to these 4 people. I'm going to ask you to not speechify, just ask your questions. Let's get to answers and let's move through this so these guys can wrap up. All right, thank you. Katie.
Hi. So my question is about the strain on infrastructure. When we had the presentation at our last full board meeting from Vicki Bean, she talked about how a lot of this was put in place by the state to prevent overloading on our infrastructure. Manhattan is the oldest, the oldest part of the city. Some of our infrastructure is over 100 years old. Is anyone at the state level discussing the implications of the strain on the infrastructure if they were to build all of this? In my opinion, I feel like Manhattan's just going to sink eventually because we're too dense.
I'm not sure that George nor Anna can. George, go ahead and try.
Well, okay, so the 12 FAR cap came from the city of New York. So before the 12 FAR cap, the MDL limited building heights to 300 feet. And that had to go because when the 1961 zoning went into place, it had unlimited height districts and a tower. So we had to get rid of the cap. And so they replaced it with 12 FAR because that's what the city wanted, right? The state never came up with that number. The city came up with that number through a decade-long planning process to develop our zoning. So the state had nothing to do with that number 12, right? It all came from the city because that's what was in the city's zoning at the time. And so, the city the infrastructure really is the city's responsibility. They sometimes ask the state for help, and sometimes the state comes in and, complains about, combined sewer overflows and things like this, and they have to end up into, consent agreements to fix things. But generally speaking, it's like the city's responsibility to maintain and keep up the infrastructure. And you're exactly right. It says right in the seeker manual that zoning densities are tuned to the infrastructure that's in place. And that's one of the reasons why we do environmental reviews, is to make certain that they have the infrastructure in place for additional density.
Thanks, George. Thank you, Katie. Andrew. Welcome.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me. There's a couple of points that were raised that I'd like to respond to because I think there were some important things that were kind of left out here. The notion that we're only going to see upzonings above 12 happen in very, very high density districts, I think is a fallacy. The most recent rezoning that the city did, so in other words, that we're only going to see above 12 applied if the cap is lifted for districts that are already close to 12. I'm not sure there's a lot of evidence to back that up. The most recent rezoning that the city did was for Soho and NoHo, which was zoned for 5 FAR, which it upzoned for up to 12 FAR. And the city made clear that they would have gone above 12 if they had been able to. I really think it's important for this board to not put the cart before the horse and start imagining ways in which the 12 FAR cap could be lifted, that could be workable, or could do more good than harm until those conditions are put in place. Right now, literally as we speak, the state legislature is debating a clean lifting of the cap with no conditions attached to it whatsoever. And so far, both the state Senate and the state Assembly have said no to it, but they are under tremendous pressure from the governor, from real estate interests, and from other groups saying you've got to lift that cap. That's the question before us right now. Do we just lift the cap and then let the city do whatever it wants with it, or do we keep it in place? I think it's an important guardrail that does much more good than harm by having it there. Certainly, it's much better to have it than to have it just lifted. If you think that with the FAR cap lifted, that the city will just on its own do good rezonings and use it in a good way with no guardrails or conditions attached to it, then I would say support lifting the FAR cap. However, if you think the city doesn't always make the best decisions, doesn't always do this in the best way, that communities, those most in need, the average New Yorkers, aren't the ones who tend to drive these zoning processes, but in fact, it's the powerful, the real estate interests who do tend to drive them, then I would say support keeping the FAR cap in place until and unless there are conditions attached to it that really make sure that we serve the interests of New Yorkers. And about the housing, the very last thing that
Andrew, I'm sorry, I really do want to be respectful of people's time. So I've given you 2 minutes already. So let's get to a question or get. Thank you, though.
Well, okay, then one last question. Do we really have a housing crisis, or do we have a crisis of not enough of the kind of housing that we need, which is affordable housing? Because lifting the cap will only allow more of the kind of housing that we don't need to get built and won't do a lot to help with the kind of housing that we really do need to get built, which is affordable housing.
Thank you, Andrew. Either panelists want to address that? It didn't seem like it was a question specifically to either of you, but.
Well, okay, if I may, I will say two things. One is Andrew is right that there may be limited areas where you know, he's right. You know, there is a relatively small part of the Soho NoHo that went to 12. That was zoned for 5, and that may very well happen. I will also say this is that 12 FAR buildings are very expensive to build. 14 FAR buildings would be more expensive to build. They are bad for affordable housing. And if you think that cost of housing is an important contributor to affordability, then that's a problem. And very often when you see 100% affordable projects go in, they very often don't even use the amount of FAR they have available. I can give you a long list of projects that are underbuilt because essentially making them bigger would have been more expensive, and the numbers didn't work out in the affordable housing calculations.
Thanks, George. Andrew Schwartz, any thoughts on that, or we can move on?
No, I agree with Andrew's point about the type of housing that's needed. You know, I think there's 1 million or over 1 million households that qualify as low income, and only 400,000 units are really available at those rents. So yes, I completely agree. I just think if there's a way to tether the FAR removal to some affordability requirement, then maybe it's something that needs to be explored. But without that, I'm not sure what you're actually voting for.
Good, thanks. Elka and then Christine. Go ahead, Elka.
Okay, so very quickly, how do we preserve the Clinton Special District? So I'm going very local, which is very important to all of those people on the Zoom tonight. So that's one question. We have an M zone, west side of 11th Avenue, that could drastically change that whole part of the city if we change the zoning. And lastly, it was discussed, you know, touched on very briefly, but keeping in this livability, whether it's I mean, you've said before, office buildings with no amenities is fine around them, living around just high rises and no parks, etc., is not desirable. So somewhere in all of this has to be livability. Thank you.
Thanks, Holcomb. Christine.
Yes, I want to follow up on something George said. And maybe this is a very long answer, but it's a short question. You said that the city used to create plans, urban plans, and say, this is how we're going to do it, and so forth. And you implied that it does not anymore. I've also heard people say that we don't have an office of urban planning, we have an office of development. Is that true? I mean, tell us more about these plans that the city used to make and why aren't they making them anymore?
Well, okay, I may be overstating it a bit because they do put out plans, but it's just, they're very thin if you look at them. And when you compare them to the older stuff, like when the city developed the tower on base building form and got rid of urban plazas. So we used to give a bonus for residential plazas. And we decided that we didn't want to do that anymore. And we replaced it with affordable housing bonus for the old affordable housing bonus and the tower and base building form. And if you read those documents, they're incredibly thorough. They're unbelievably great planning documents that came out of that era in the 1980s, along with the development of the R8B zoning district and the mapping of those districts. And you look at them and they're just exhausted and you just go, wow, this was really well done. And when you look at our more current plans, while they look great because they have great graphics in them, I feel like there's just not a lot of content and they're pretty thin. And so I don't want to say that they don't do any planning. There's a Department of City Planning. They do work, but it's much more instrumental as opposed to, you know, an honest exploration of different possibilities. That's one man's opinion, and you could probably get people who disagree with me. But the quality is notable if you actually dig into these things.
Excellent. Thanks, George. That was a great wrap for us. So Andrew and George and Anna, who had to leave, I want to thank you again for your time tonight. It's very, very generous of you to spend your time with us. It's clearly a very complex issue, a lot of different angles and perspectives and controversies that will fester through. So I appreciate your time. I also want to thank everybody from the public for coming. It was a nice, robust conversation. Well over 40 people here in attendance. And I see a lot of Block Association people here. I see a lot of other community board members here. I see elected official representatives here. So I'm very pleased with this conversation. As a reminder, the working group will continue to meet next month and we'll keep hashing through these topics. So thank you all very much and have a good night.
A lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Good meeting.